Hello everybody, welcome to this presentation called From Overtourism to Responsive and Relevant Urban Tourism. To start with, of course, it's a crying shame that we have to do it in this way and that I cannot be there, we cannot be there together to discuss tourism. But yeah, given the whole situation, it's a small thing, a small price to pay. So yeah, in the grand scheme of things, it's not too bad, luckily. At least on my side, we are all healthy. So I hope that's also the case on your side. My name is Koens. I'm a professor of new urban tourism at in Holland University. And I need to go to the next slide here. I also work at Breda University of Applied Sciences and also research associate at Johannesburg University. What do? I write basically some books, do some journal articles as what one does as an academic, and my emphasis recently really been on sustainable urban tourism. Worked initially quite a lot on overtourism, but I had already made the transition before COVID-19, and of course now everybody is talking about how do we need to do it more sustainably. So we'll see what can come out of that. Because the situation has just instantly changed, only several months ago. I would like to just basically start to understand some of the issues that are underlying urban tourism, just travel back in time. It just makes it a little bit easier to understand, okay, what has actually gone on here. So suddenly we're in February. We're still all very hopeful that we can meet each other in Dubrovnik. And the world's a different place. So I'm not talking about perceptions of tourism until then, basically realizing, of course, that it has changed, but with an idea of better understanding what are the underlying issues and what's going on here. And let's start with a bit of a history of tourism. What we've seen up until February was the tourism numbers were really increasing rapidly, and particularly in cities. Cities were the fastest growing type of tourism destination there was. Faster than beaches, faster than islands, faster than mountainous tourism, rural tourism. It really was urban tourism which was on the up. Whilst it was okay, or seemed okay, because cities are of course quite resilient and they're made for people, it's very different from, for example, rural areas where nature should be all encompassing. We did start to really notice disturbances. And what we saw this happened particularly when there was a rapid place change as the residents made way for tourists. And I'm basically using the terms residents and tourists now just to highlight some key groups. It's more nuanced. There's different types of local users and visitors, but just to show basically where the dynamics were going. And you could see, for example, places that always had a very much a local usage portfolio, so place really entered suddenly local people had to share them with visitors, and you sort of change go actually quite quickly in certain areas, and that's the kind of areas where we have seen most issues related to tourism. So it's not so much, for example, in Paris, the Eiffel Tower, which receives a lot of visitors, really a lot of visitors, or the city centre of London, the City of London, the banking bit, that also receives a lot of visitors. But you don't hear that many issues. It really is where residents and visitors are basically cohabiting, co-using space, and the change in dynamics there that are seriously causing issues. Now, this has of course been called overtourism in 2016. I think you Skift, who trademarked the term and just ran with it. And now we're more or less stuck with it. I don't really like the term, as I'll explain later, but for now it's just also very important to know that overtourism is nothing new. I mean, negative impacts on host societies have been common in the tourism literature for ages. Like in the 1950s and 60s, we were already talking about this, particularly in British seaside resorts, like what happens to these places because of tourism. And we've had numerous very interesting interpretations, carrying capacity, limits of acceptable change, to deal with these issues? Well, of course, there is the classic. I presume you all know it, Butler's tourist area life cycle. This is by now 40 years old. So that is actually quite like ancient nearly, if you see how fast things go now in the world. And already it was about like, okay, we have rapid growth and so everybody's happy, and then suddenly you get this stagnation and potential decline. So overtourism is nothing new, and the issues with tourism, really nothing new, even in an urban setting, because the tourist area life cycle is based largely on that work of British seaside resorts. So it's based on city tourism. So there's nothing new there. But when I say there's nothing new, the advent of overtourism, the issues that we've seen with that now, are because of some discernible differences. As of basically the start of the 21st century, you really saw a rapid increase of mobility. I mean, local carriers came in lots of places in the world, and mobility has become cheaper. And particularly airports, they're based near cities, big cities. So that really increased growth to cities with regards to visitors. And after the crisis of the late 2000s, the economic crisis, tourism, which was one of the very few industries that kept on growing consistently, was really heralded more or less as a savior. Like, this is a strategy to recover economies. It's a low impact economy strategy, as it has been termed that way. So there really was this emphasis on stimulating tourism growth. And then you see in the third point, that correlated with an emphasis on self-regulation. So we want tourism to grow, so we take away a lot of boundaries for tourism, because then it can grow and bring the economic benefits that it should bring to the cities. At the same time, we've also now seen that the internet has given a lot of rise to uncontrolled spread. So we've lost a lot of the control that we used to have over tourism. We can measure it to a large extent because we knew where people were going, but with places like Airbnb, that's become much more difficult. Also other short-term rental services. And Instagram, for example, if something becomes a hit on Instagram, lots of people come there. You cannot plan for that. How are you going to deal with that? So what you saw with the focus on strong growth is like, we've increasingly started to focus on tourist experiences rather than on local impacts. With that uncontrolled spread, you could see basically it becoming more difficult to measure tourism. And finally, with the self-regulation, the big problem there was, how do you ensure the relevance of tourism to a local context? If you have no control, if you're not managing, if you allow the industry to manage itself, how are you going to ensure that that the development and the way it develops is relevant to your context, and not just box standard anything? So these are serious things that have changed in recent years and have contributed, at least partially, to the advent of overtourism. Why do I hate the term overtourism, and with me many others? Because it oversimplifies things. If you say overtourism, it implies too much tourism. And fair enough, too many visitors is one element of overtourism. It can be too busy. You see there the roller cases. But of course it's more complicated than that. You don't need too many visitors. You just need some who have very negative effects. As you see in the middle picture. That never makes a local person very happy to see that. And then finally, you have too much tourism industry and supply. And I still like the old logo of Airbnb much better than the new one. So that's Airbnb. We often talk about Nutella pancake shops in this context, so city centers that just become over-touristified. Airbnb also is basically an oversupply of the tourism industry. And I say Airbnb, of course, I mean short-term rental services, because there's lots of them. With regards to the latter, this is an example. This is already quite old. I think it's 2016 or 17. Berlin Kreuzberg of 2014 even, oh my god. But it's so nice and telling. The brown dots are short-term rental houses for rent at a certain time, in Berlin-Kreuzberg. Well, the 10th of December 2014. So you see 102 of them. At the same time, this is the single house that's available for rent for local tenants. So you see here, this is a touristification of an area in a different way, in a much more difficult to see way, less visible way than city centers. But it is happening. So those three elements are very different aspects of the same beast that is now termed over-tourism. But you cannot really compare them. They're very different. And you need to be aware of those differences if you actually want to do anything about it. So whilst it's complex, in media discourses often it gets oversimplified. You cannot really, well, you can blame the media, but this is the way it works. It needs to be simple and it needs to be fed through so that a lot of people can quickly read it. And of course, this is even worse on platforms like Facebook and those other social media platforms where things get shared. But if you realize that different types of over-tourism require different solutions, this does not help, this oversimplification. So we need to find a way to better understand this. And the first step towards that is by acknowledging, in essence, that all those three elements that we see, yes, they're caused by tourism growth and by visitors. But it's also an aspect that's due to societal changes. See some below. The left bottom, I always like the example that in Amsterdam there can be complaints about people being too noisy with their little boats in the evenings, and then it's easy to blame the visitor, to blame the tourist. But of course for tourists it's much more difficult to rent a boat in the evening long term, till late in the evening, than it is for local people, regional people, who just own a boat in the area. So a lot of the disturbance can also be because of local people, but it's easier to blame it on the visitor. Another societal trend is just growth in general. It's, nearly all big European, at least, cities have seen massive growth of commuters and of inhabitants, and they put pressure on public infrastructure. So infrastructure is already under pressure because of that, and then you have the growth of tourism on top of that. Another one, a third one there, what you see the picture on your right bottom, is the laptops. People working much more from cafes now. In the olden days, and the olden days here is literally 20 years ago max, working in cafes was really not done that much. There just were no laptops. So where are you going to work? You're going to go to your office. But now you can see that people work much more from different places and also have more meetings in cafes, which brings together local usage and visitor usage much more close together, where it can possibly bang heads, so where it can possibly engage with each other. And this is a new thing. So those are just changes in society that have made it more impactful, but are not really directly related to tourism. And in essence, this is what has started to happen more and more. Particularly in all the policy discourses, you had people talking about tourists, residents, commuters, day visitors, and a workforce. And they were all seen as separate little elements. And in several cities around the world, this is still happening. So we're thinking, oh yeah, they're nice, let's talk about tourists, and let's talk about residents. But if you look at their movements and the way they act and what they do, the right-hand side of the picture is much more realistic. This all goes together. It's one big mess. So how are you going to cope with that? What can we do with that? Now, what you see in policy responses is that the emphasis very much been on tourism, and three different elements of tourism. The first one is we call resource-based, basically resource-based. It's limiting the number of tourists or tourism impact with regulation. This can be taxes, this can just be prohibiting certain things. but it's just you put limits. The second one is activity-based, like increasing the number of activities that visitors can do. So you just create more infrastructure and you can cope with more visitors. It's very popular amongst industry representative organizations because, of course, that stimulates growth. Hurrah, that's what we apparently all need. And then the third one, which is slightly more popular recently, is community-based, and it's dealing with that relationship and role of local communities in tourism. So that is starting to move into a more holistic, systemic perspective of managing tourism. But if you look at what is happening at the moment, strategies for dealing with over-tourism, one could also say just tourism in general, you can see that the emphasis really is on increasing capacity. The past 20 years, that has been the dominant force within tourism, to even deal with the negative impacts of tourism. More capacity, more capacity. You can see regulation has really not been popular recently, but the communication has had some. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. If you want to learn more about these specific strategies, you can basically go online and get a summary of the over-tourism reports, which explain them a bit more. But suffice to say, the emphasis has really been on increasing capacity. What are ways to do that? For example, here in London, it's a mobile gaming app to encourage visitors to go to certain destinations. So you're spreading in different ways, and it's a special interest. It's a better tourist experience you expect for a small niche, but that's okay. You take that niche elsewhere. What happens in Paris and in Berlin, they've done it also other places. Use street artists to fight noise pollution. You place some street artists in areas where there is potentially a lot of noise pollution by visitors, and they go and stand in a place where you can make a bit of noise. So then instantly visitors are drawn to that, because a lot of, particularly what they now call new urban tourism, where you act like a local and you have the local experience, so to say, you just walk through normal suburbs where there's not that much to do for visitors. So you then suddenly have an activity that really draws visitors, and it's an effective way to try to limit noise pollution for residents. Another one to limit noise pollution, obligation of using earphones in large groups. This does not sound like rocket science, I know, but it is difficult. Legally, apparently, Amsterdam and Bruges are experimenting with it. This is quite tricky. Yeah, I don't know why, but apparently it is, and I trust them. This is a quite radical type of thing, and this is a policy. If you have 20 people, you need to use earphones for a tour group. So those are some examples. If you look at the examples, and I've already alluded to it, you can see that those solutions we have offered up till now are effect-oriented and really focused on tourism. They don't really look at the process of tourism or what really are underlying causes. And growth is not really questioned that much. See here, this is the tourism strategy of Copenhagen, and it's called The End of Tourism as We Know It Towards a New Beginning of Localhood. Now that sounds amazing, but it still just assumes tourism growth as normal, as the normality. So it's even this, and this is one of the most advanced tourism policy documents or ideas that are out there. Growth has not been questioned up until recently. But of course, if tourism is such a highly complex issue, like I've just tried to discuss a little bit, you cannot solve it with these simple, smart solutions that deal with effects. So you try a technical solution. It's not enough. And what's been particularly difficult is that very little efforts have been put on how to respond to unexpected problems, to really deal with like what we did not know. And of course, yeah, this is what we've just had. One of these massively unexpected problems, and you can see that the entire industry has collapsed, completely annihilated. And naturally, it's mostly because of all kinds of travel bans, but it's quite shocking to see how we went from supposed over-tourism in many places to no tourism. And now there's really great difficulty among a lot of people in the industry on how we're going to survive this. And it's a very sad story for a lot of individual entrepreneurs who've lost everything they've worked for. So it's a really sad situation. At the same time, this quote has been used a lot of time by a lot of people. This is Rahm Emanuel, former advisor of Obama. And he says basically, let the grass go to waste, and you can use it as an opportunity to do things you could not do before. Now this is sad as it is, and I definitely do not want to basically frame COVID-19 as any sort of good thing, because it really is not. It's awful. Also for the tourism industry. But we may be able now to put changes into place that we've not been able to. We may be able to change the paradigm from growth to something else. And that is a very exciting and interesting thing. That I'm wondering, like, how are we going to do that? Well, what you can see now is like an option that you have in these kind of crisis situations. You can use them to make bucket loads of money. Airbnb really took off and took flight during the economic crisis of 2008-2009. In New York, there were lots of people with big houses. They needed to do something with them, and they started renting them out on Airbnb. It's made the company big. So that's one way to deal with it. I personally prefer the second one. It's try to improve the visitor economy to make all people involved, all stakeholders involved, just happier and more pleased with it. What does that mean? Happier and more pleased with it. What I mean with it is changing the face of tourism and leisure and cultural experiences long term, and in which we try to prevent excesses and make the city work better for all. So just really make this a place, look at it as a system. How can you make this work for as many people as possible that make use of the city system? How can the city be a good host to as many people as possible? Can never be all, but we can try to see what we can do for loads of people. And then you get, in my LinkedIn bubble, internet bubble, this is a lot of things that I see. It's like unleashing the power of tourism. Could a more responsible tourism emerge? What can we do? This is an opportunity. This is great. We're going to be, it's as transformative, resilient. Well, God, what other buzzwords do you have? Because that's really the problem that we have now. These are all buzzwords. And what does it mean? Like, of course, I want, to be fair, particularly the picture on the left, it's a good bit of work. And the vision and the idea is a dot on the horizon, so to speak. Yes, that is what I want. But I've seen so little, really, really little work that has said, and this is how we're going to do it. We may be wrong, but we think that this is how we're going to do it. And that is, I think, the big shame that we have now, because unless we as, I don't know, are we tourism professionals, academics, educationals, students, doesn't matter. People with ideas about tourism, unless we really look at that how question and very soon start bringing in new ideas of how we can achieve these wonderful goals, it is going to go back to business as usual, because basically the lobby has already started. We need to go back to old numbers. We need to grow again. So that is worrying. And this basically summarizes. I think there's just too much talk about what tourism ought to be, but how do we get there? And it worries me. Because the transformative changes that we need, they're not easy to achieve. And they will require a change of thinking. And that people need to be motivated for that. We need to put fire into the bellies of people that they want this. Because if not, it's going to go back to normal. If we want to instigate changes, we need to know that there are tensions between different people on this matter. So you cannot expect there not to be tensions between a tourism entrepreneur who wants his business to grow again, basically seeing his life work fall apart, and a visitor who's now suddenly very happy that the city is theirs again. As a resident who's very happy that the city is theirs again. There's tensions there. We need to be open about and acknowledge it and find ways of managing that or bringing them together or deal with that. Bringing those stakeholders with different interests around the table where they can talk rather than fight amongst each other. And I also don't have the solution, I have to admit. But let's think about that. How can we do that? We need to also pay attention to the effects of increasing inequity or inequality between different groups of people, the people who profit and the people who don't profit. It's often been mentioned that it's an issue within Airbnb. If you have the money to own a house, then you can profit from Airbnb and similar short-term rental services. But we also need to pay attention to what creates a quality of life. What is a good quality of life? That is not a tourism question. But we need to know the answer if we want to basically develop tourism in a way that goes beyond business as usual. Also, we need to appreciate the power relations in my perspective. There are strong lobbies and power relations. They always have been there and they will always be there. And that's just a fact of life. If we understand them, then we may be able to work with them if we want to create change. If we don't understand them, we don't stand a chance. So that's really tricky. Now I also, like I said, don't have the solutions. I have some ideas and I'd like to, at the end of this talk, share them with you. For me, if we want to move forward, we need to look beyond economic gain as a value of tourism. The buzzword at the moment is sustainable value creation, and I love that. Sustainable value creation. If you're here with a group, sitting with a group, please get a piece of paper now and write down for yourself what you think is sustainable value creation, and then write down one way of how you're going to achieve that. If you just do that and then afterwards compare with each other notes. I wonder if it's the same thing. For me, it's really one of those words that is so empty that you can fit it with anything, and thus you cannot disagree with it. But it also doesn't help us get there anywhere, because if we don't know what it is, it's something different for everyone. So rather than talk about it in that way, I've tried to make it a bit clearer what I understand about it. And for me, it means moving beyond the triple P, people, planet, profit approach, to include issues like equality, nature, quality of life, experience quality. Because that is basically, they're all social elements that are very relevant to tourism and the visitor economy, but have not always received as much attention as they, I think, need to have. And also, I think we need to go towards a systemic approach where it involves stakeholders from outside of tourism. We need responsive networks, people who can work together, who do not need to have any real interest in tourism per se, but we need to understand as tourism professionals to understand what they do and how they work. It's like I said previously, we need to have knowledge of basically elements that are not directly related to tourism. What one does as an academic, you make a model. This is a model, and the paper below it explains a little bit more about how I see all these things. And then the goal of that has always been to come towards resilient destinations, and with resilient we need responsive. We can respond to things that get thrown at us. And in our perspective, with New Roads Papers, we believe you can only achieve that if you talk to people and if you have those networks involved, these responsive networks from an entire system within a city. It's incredibly difficult to get, but I think really I'm convinced that it is necessary to really create these resilient places. So how do we get to these happy places then? This is a bit more concrete and practical. What do I think we can do? It's moving beyond the binary tourist resident perspective. Cities are just places of hospitality, I think. But it is important to think about like who owns the city and what is a local community and how can we ensure that different groups live together. That's the kind of questions that I would like to answer or would like to get answers to, rather than this brilliant site of like what does tourism need to look like. Once we know the answers to this, then we can start working towards these great visions. Mentioned this already several times, a systemic perspective, systems perspective, and look at processes. at a local level. A lot of issues in tourism are related on the local level, so we need to understand what's important there, what happens there. At the same time, we can link it with wider and larger political issues like a new urban agenda or sustainable development goals to create a broader input. But it starts, to me, on the local level. Ik zie de Reizen naar Morgen, that's Flemish, and that's a travel campaign basically where they have done something very simple, very right. They've started talking to people who live in an area, what do you want of tourism? That is a core element of that strategy, tourism policy strategy. And it works because you suddenly start to get a much more nuanced understanding of what is tourism to the people who live there and what can we do with it. So this is such a simple thing, but it helps us to move towards a better type of tourism. Just asking, talking to people what they want and see if we can deal with that. And this is one that I mentioned already before, like technology and design are useful tools, but we need to understand relationships. That's where, for me, it's at. Now I want to, because of course this is all in quite highbrow, high level, just relatively, some practical ideas, like what can you also think about? Let's start thinking about practical ideas and strategies to make tourism different, change it. And I would like, if you have ideas, please email them to me. I'd be very interested to hear about them. But some things I thought of was like, if you have an Airbnb, say you have 2 listings on Airbnb, fair enough. Every one more, you need to put one house up for rent for local renters. I don't know whether this is legally possible. Probably not. But there's a crisis here, and a crisis is a good way to think about things differently. So this is something, maybe we can do it. Make an agreement with companies that they will only be bailed out at the next crisis, and there will be a next crisis, if they are serious about sustainable tourism. We're not bailing out the big airliners anymore if they just don't do anything now about climate change. It's an agreement you can make as a government, I think, at least, and if not, we can make it work. Interesting one there is, as a government, decide how much money you want from tourism and just make tourism fit rather than the other way around. It's actually a petition in Amsterdam now that asks for this, like literally asks for, we want a maximum, this is a number of people in Amsterdam, and we want that policy is made on that basis rather than on the financial basis. Can try if it works or not. Another one that we can do, create a list of 10 main problems in the city and just ask tourism companies to help solve them. You give companies more responsibility, but you can see what they can do. And these are just some ideas. And I don't know if they will work. Probably not. But for me, what I am missing in the debate at the moment are these kind of simple ideas. They may be hollow, they may not be possible, but they actually give us ideas and little steps forward towards achieving these greater aims. And I really hope that we can come up with more of them. So please, if you have any more, let me know. Be amazing. Then this is the final slide. For a long-term solution, it's quite useful to contemplate post-corona growth or degrowth. Do we really want, and degrowth here does not mean less because we're already at the bottom, but do we want that growth that we had? Or do we want it in a different way? And do we want to use transport tourism just only to focus on the quality of life for local people, for the people who normally live there already? Or is that also for people who live there for a longer term? Like increasingly you have digital nomads who live somewhere for 3-4 months. How can we make it work for them? But in the whole, I really like this idea that Krippendorf in '85 already brought up. It's basically, let's try to improve the quality of life of, he says, residents. I would say people at the places where they spend most of their daily life. So much that they don't really feel the need to travel so much anymore. If people are very happy at the places that they spend most of their time, they don't have to travel as much, and they're still probably happier than they would be otherwise. So I think, wouldn't that be a great idea? That probably is a little bit naive of me, but still, I'd like to see that happen. thank you very much for this the opportunity to speak here and to talk. Yeah, this is shameless self-promotion, I know, but if you have any ideas, like little practical ideas of how to deal with tourism, really contact me, because I would love to collate them all into one, and then hopefully together we can basically put this out somewhere as a way to help the industry and help tourism and help societies to move a bit further. So if you can help with that, that would be amazing, and if not, that is fine. I hope you enjoyed it, you learned something from it, and would like to say, like with these references, just thank you very much for your time, and hopefully next year we'll be able to meet each other in real life. For now, just enjoy I don't know, your own rooms, and enjoy the opening up, and let's hope that we can keep on opening up and we don't have to go back to any sort of lockdown soon. Thank you very much.